Um, Good morning and happy Human Rights Day. Thank you all for being here. Woohoo, right? It's still a thing. Thank you to our co-hosts, our panelists, and of course to our keynote, Congressman Joaquin Castro. My name is Amanda Klasing. I am the National Director of Government Relations and Advocacy at Amnesty International USA. And on behalf of the co-host for today's events, the Anti-Corruption Advocacy Network, ACAN, the Forum on Arms Trade, and Amnesty International USA, I welcome you to the 2025 Annual Conference of the Forum on the Arms Trade. We're focused on building community connections for better policy, and today brings together experts in the responsible arms trade, human rights, and anti-corruption communities on International Human Rights Day, no less, to assess a rapidly changing political and security environment. Jeff Abramson from the Forum approached me about co-hosting this year's event a few months ago and holding it on Human Rights Day. At the time, the list of concerning developments and policy changes that affected both of our communities of practice were already starting to pile up, including highly controversial changes to the implementation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the reported, but at that time not yet implemented, removal of topics from the annual human rights report, the provision of weapons and other assistance to corrupt and repressive regimes, and the use of military force both inside and outside the borders of the United States, and more. Jeff and Jody Vittori from the ACAN and I shared a belief that now, more than ever, our communities need to build our work together to meet this moment, which brings us here today. And I'm grateful to be gathered on Human Rights Day, the day each year we celebrate the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UDHR, back in 1948. I'd like to start the conference today by acknowledging the beautiful hubris and audacity of the human rights experiment. Born out of the atrocities of World War II, alongside the United Nations system, our modern understanding of human rights is enshrined in this milestone document, which recognizes, I quote, the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. Coming out of the devastation of a war that exceeded all bounds of horror, for the first time, countries came together and agreed on the freedoms and rights that deserve universal protection in order for every person, every single individual, to live their lives freely, equally, and in dignity. Imagine that, countries recognizing that regardless of sovereign or identity, all people are endowed with certain rights. This extraordinary achievement occurred with U.S. leadership as a response to the barbarous acts which outraged the conscience of mankind. That's a quote. And we have to understand that in adopting the Declaration, human rights weren't just a sideshow to the founding of the UN. No. Countries recognized human rights to be the foundation for freedom, justice, and peace. Basic principles of human rights law and norms are grounded in the fundamental belief that all human rights are equally important. There's one basic principle that underlies all human rights law. Every person across the world, no matter their circumstances, have the same human rights. And I start with this today because it's important to understand what is at stake with recent policy changes. It's nothing less than the idea of human dignity. That is why I am so honored to be introducing our keynote speaker today. As ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee on the Western Hemisphere, the subcommittee tasked with oversight of the human rights apparatus within the State Department, Congressman Joaquin Castro has long demonstrated his commitment to human rights and human dignity. He's introduced and co-sponsored countless bills to advance human rights across the region and the world, to promote transparency and accountability for rights abusers, to protect against corruption in countries like Honduras, and to stop the trafficking of arms used by transnational criminal organizations in the region. This year, in fact, he co-sponsored a new bill called the Silver Shield Act that would expand end-use monitoring to include monitoring the use of U.S. defense articles and determine whether articles were used to commit serious violations of international humanitarian or human rights law. Just last week, the congressman introduced a bipartisan war powers resolution with Representatives Massey and McGovern to block the Trump administration's escalating hostilities towards Venezuela. In doing so, he is working to ensure that Congress continues to play its crucial role of oversight in addressing the extrajudicial killings of dozens of people in Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition to this demonstrated commitment to addressing human rights, corruption, and responsible arms trade. I could also read to you his impressive resume. However, as a fellow native San Antonian, I know that the only data point that matters if you're from San Antonio is where you went to high school. He's a proud Thomas Jefferson grad, which my dad is as well. And with that, I am so pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, Congressman Joaquin Castro.
Good morning, everyone. How are y'all doing? Good morning. Happy Human Rights Day. I want to say, first of all, thank you very much for joining us this morning and for inviting me to be part of this. And thank you to Amnesty International, the Anti-Corruption Advocacy Network, and the Forum on Arms Trade for organizing today's event. And also each and every one of you in all of your organizations and your roles for all the work that y'all do in advancing and respecting human rights. I also want to thank Amanda Klasing for the invitation. As she mentioned, we're both San Antonians, which is very special, at least to us. So great to be with you. And also want to thank the veterans and current and former State Department staffers that are here with us today, who've endured a lot this year. Thank you for all of your work over the years. I, of course, am Joaquin Castro and proud to represent my hometown of San Antonio in the U.S. Congress. And I serve on both the Intelligence Committee and have for about 10 years, or going on 10 years, and also the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where I'm the ranking member on the subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere that also includes purview over human rights. And today we honor the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Adopted in 1948 after the horrors of World War II, the nations of the world came together and said something simple but revolutionary. Every human being has inherent dignity, and every person has rights that no government, no leader, no ideology can strip away. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was more than a list of rights. It was a statement of truth. It was pursued in the spirit of justice and respect for every individual. And the truth about our inalienable rights as human beings, which each of us is owed, and in turn, what we owe one another, is important today as it was back then. But I want to speak to you today mostly as a legislator who served on these two committees that, of course, are in the middle of a discussion and the legislation around human rights. Because I think that we are in a kind of conundrum today. We are, in one sense, in a golden age of knowing. We are in an age of knowing. Let me describe to you what I mean by that. And before I talk about global issues, I want to take you back to a time in the United States that I think was a precursor of what was to come. And I'm 51 years old. I know some folks here, maybe a few at least as I look around, are senior to me. Many are junior in terms of age. But for those of you that remember 1991, I want to take you back to Los Angeles, California, where by accident, somebody filmed the very brutal beating of Rodney King. And that beating was filmed and was then shared. There was no social media at the time, but it was shared across news stations across the world. And the United States and the world came to see an example of police brutality in a way that we had never or hardly ever seen before. We didn't know it at the time, but it was a precursor of what was to come in terms of understanding something very important when it comes to advocating for human rights. A very basic thing, and that is to know what is happening. So the technology that we have today, the great part about that technology is that it allows us to know what is happening. It allows us to appreciate a reality that in the past we argued about. So my wife Anna and I have 3 kids, and those of you that are parents or when you were growing up with your family, you know that as parents, you have kids that will come into the room and say, he hit me, or she hit me, or he started it, or she started it. And what's the challenge? A big part of the challenge is that you didn't actually see what happened. And so you struggle to piece together who's responsible for what, or whether, my daughter actually hit my son as hard as he said. And because of that, you struggle with accountability and consequences for the actions. So to me, when I say that we are in an age of knowing, unlike any other, Everybody in this world, those with cell phones at least, which is a lot, not everybody, is essentially a social documentarian of the world around them. There's a second piece of technology that has enabled that to be very powerful. And then I want to talk about a few examples. The second piece of that is that it's not just knowing what happened as an individual who can capture the world around you, but secondarily, distributing that very quickly on social media platforms. So Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok. Those posts that can move people and move the world, those are creations of the last, or perfections at least, of the last dozen or 15 years, is to know what happened and then to distribute that reality very quickly. Without that combination of technology, do we know exactly, or would public opinion have moved as much on Gaza, for example, or even on Ukraine? I would say the answer is probably no. So it's a very powerful age that we're in, this age of knowing and the ability to share that reality. So I would argue that as we go forward, that human beings have a right to reality. A right to reality. Now, I say that because we are facing threats that I think will affect human rights that will distort that reality. So when we consider, for example, deep fakes, when we also see efforts to hide the truth or to mess with algorithms so that reality isn't seen, those are attempts in the 21st century to essentially negate reality, to say that something that we see happening isn't actually happening, or once again, to hide it and bury it so that people don't see it and so that people don't act on it. That, too, is a product of technology. So I said that we're in a kind of golden age, but also in a conundrum. We're in a golden age because technology has developed where we actually know and we can distribute what we see, but we're actually in a very powerful conundrum because technology is such that reality can be denied, can be distorted, can be changed, can be affected in ways that are also very incredibly profound. And I said that I wanted to speak to you as a legislator because of all the things that, obviously, that I do in my job, making decisions about what legislation we propose, how we vote on legislation, what we do in the Foreign Affairs Committee or the Intelligence Committee, is affected by all of these things, all of these factors. So as we're in this age of knowing, the question is, are we in an age of action? Because once you know something is going on, in 1991, when we saw that beating of Rodney King, those police officers were later tried. You remember, though, in the first trial, they were let off. They were not held accountable. The United States Congress, I think, to our detriment, has been sidelined for a long time when it comes to human rights and other issues. I don't mean totally sidelined, but I mean we haven't been as good as we could be. In fact, going back to the idea of technology, the United States Congress has been very deferential to 21st century technologies. A lot of things simply have not been regulated or governed upon. So think, for example, about different areas of technological development. Think about drones, for example, and everything that has happened with drones, including human rights abuses, commercial spyware. So drones and weaponry, commercial spyware, and cybersecurity, we'll put it in that category. Crypto and financial services, AI, obviously, itself. And then I would argue even in the 20th century, in the 1990s, the internet. Even the internet was hardly regulated or hardly been regulated. There's a lot of debate about how you would do that or how much you should do it, but it speaks to a Congress that has mostly been sidelined when it comes to regulation of these very powerful, important pieces of technology that are fundamentally changing human life and also affecting the way people are treated around the world and the way leaders are treated around the world. And so I ask the question whether we're in an age of action. I don't think over this last generation we can say that we fully have committed as much as we could to the respect for human rights. I'm not speaking about your work. I'm speaking about the work of governments, given what we've seen and what we know and what we could do as governments around the world. Some have been much better than others, obviously. I speak mostly about the United States government and the challenge that we face here in respecting human rights. But let me give you a few examples about how this is and why this has been so powerful. I spoke about Gaza and what has happened there. And I've said that the atrocities there, I believe, amount to a kind of ethnic cleansing in what has happened. But that has, in different ways, been denied. It's been obscured, hidden. There's also been an unwillingness of Congress to act. And I'll give you an example from today. Later today, I'm supposed to go to a foreign affairs hearing, a subcommittee hearing on the Middle East. And there's a hearing on the West Bank that's going on. And there isn't a single Palestinian voice that's going to be part of that panel. So even as we talk about issues of technology and knowing what's going on, as you know in your role as advocates, those are still meaningful to know, and it affects public opinion, and we see that in the polls. But does it affect legislative action? Does anybody actually act on those things in a Congress or in a governing body that can make a difference? At the United Nations, there has been action that's been taken that's been very important. But I will say, and I'll say this as a Democrat even, or I'll say it specifically as a Democrat, I've never seen a larger gap within the Democratic Party of where the public is on an issue and where Democrats are in particular, and where Democratic politicians in Congress are. That gap, as somebody who has served now for 23 years in public service, that gap to me on a singular issue is the largest that I've ever seen. In other words, a group of elected officials unwilling to follow or to move to where their public is on an issue. I told some friends in Congress that I felt like it was kind of for Democrats the same way that we critique Republicans on the issue of guns, gun safety. There are horrendous mass shootings at schools. Down the road from San Antonio, you had Uvalde, where many young children died. El Paso, Texas, in 2019, where 23 people were killed because the shooter claimed that they were, quote unquote, Hispanic invaders to Texas. We see those tragedies and we ask a basic question, often of conservatives or Republicans. We see what's happening, why won't you do something about it? Why won't you change on policy? And instead of moving wisely, we believe, towards making it harder for dangerous people to get guns, they move in the other direction. And they make it easier. And we're confounded by that. Why would you do that? I have asked myself that question with respect to this issue in Gaza, why we have not taken more swift action to do something to stop it. The technology piece is important, but the action piece is ultimately, I believe, what makes the biggest difference. And that's why your work is so incredibly important. The work of advocacy that y'all do, also the work of uncovering and highlighting human rights violations. You know, I'm talking about technology and how an individual can distribute those images around the world, but it's also the work of uncovering those things. The press, the traditional press still matters, still makes a big difference. The work that you do in pressing people, in sharing the information that you have, in going out into the field, so to speak, and being on the ground, makes a big difference in all of this. And as we think about these things, and to me, like I said, in many ways, it's a very satisfying time because you can see for yourself those images, not just in Gaza. I say satisfying because you want to know what's happening, but also, for example, with what we see in Venezuela, in the Caribbean with the boat strikes. That's not an example of somebody holding a cell phone up and showing what happened with those boat strikes, but it is an image of video showing us, although we want the release of that second part, where they, I believe, committed a war crime and killed survivors from that boat. But in all of those things, it is a very important time to know we have to encourage action, because I think that there is an onslaught of technology that is coming that is going to be both overwhelming in some ways, but also more challenging to human beings and humanity. This first phase, I think, will be struggling to figure out what is real, like I said. You know, we're in this period where we're still able to distinguish what is real and what isn't. But if y'all look around, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, you see that with artificial intelligence, it's becoming harder and harder. The technology is simply getting better and better. So the ability to either create false narratives or outright deny reality is becoming more powerful. And that's also important because knowing what happened is only part of a larger truth. You know, for example, we see a video, we also have to understand the context behind that video and what happened. And there is a contextual debate about what the actual truth is on things, that despite what you see, that debate rages on. So there are other ways that the truth can be attacked in addition to the distortions of reality, or the attempted distortions of reality. And in the Intelligence Committee, we talk about this almost on a weekly basis because I believe that it's going to be incredibly powerful. And it's also going to affect not just the issue of human rights, but the second piece that I want to talk about, the new human rights. When we think about human rights, we think about, for example, forced labor. We think about mass murder and mass rape. We think about what's going on with the Uyghurs in China. I think about mass imprisonment in El Salvador and the deprivation of rights there. But more and more, I believe that the question of human rights will not just affect vulnerable people, destitute people, outcast people. More and more, the question and the issue of human rights will center around each of us. On the issue of labor, for example, I saw, and I wish I could remember who it was, but there was one of the, I don't know if it was a tech giant or like a mid-giant, you know, not like Elon Musk, but like one of the more middle-level people, who made the comment that I think in, I don't know, let's just say 5 years, it was a few years, a handful of years, that people would not have to work. Well, that sounds good, right? Like, oh, I have to work, I can hang out. But wait a minute. Not being able to work, how is anybody going to make a living? How are you going to support yourself and your family? How are you going to pay your bills? I saw another report about the automation of driving. Y'all may have seen yesterday, there was this case in San Francisco where there were 3 Waymo cars. Did anybody see that article? There were 3 Waymo cars that caused a traffic jam because they had all stalled, and the other vehicles couldn't get around them. And it's kind of a funny story about what we could see on the roads, not just of San Francisco, but of the country in years to come. It's funny, but Uber driving is the way, it was supposed to be the way that people who lost a job could actually get work for a bit, even if temporarily. So all this displacement of labor, there were supposed to be other avenues for people to support themselves and find work. What happens more and more when that goes away? Where the human element of participation in the labor force is no longer there or is very reduced. So I'm saying that I believe that these ways that we've thought about what constitutes human rights will be incredibly expanded over the years to come. That it's not just about the injustices that we've seen or we've mostly focused on, including in Congress in the past decades, but more and more coming down to the individual. We have to assert the right to be human and participate in society, because that itself, that fundamental thing, is going to get challenged in the coming years. I see it as we discuss it, not so much on foreign affairs, but absolutely on intelligence and how we deal with that. So when I said that Congress has mostly been sidelined, that it's refused to participate in governance in these 21st century technologies, what I mean is that we're dealing with a situation where a government is either unwilling or unprepared, unfortunately, to handle what's coming. And also is either actively supporting, accelerating, or tolerating these developments without a plan to deal with the human side of it. So how does your work look in 10 or 15 or 20 years? I think that it will be incredibly expanded for those of you that are working on human rights. I think that it will be incredibly expanded to include, again, not just the things that we've worked on in the past, but the issues of everyday, what we would consider everyday people who are coming and going in this very country. And I can tell you there's still a lot of work to do in Congress to make sure that we can deal with those issues. But none of the positive things have happened without your work and the work of your organizations. And none of the great things to come will happen without your participation and without your work. And so I wanted to be here most of all to say thank you all very much for every single thing that you're doing to advocate. Please know that on Capitol Hill, there are many folks who embrace your work, who want to hear from you, who take your opinion and your perspective very seriously, and who are moved by it. But your voice is needed now more than ever, because we are in an age of knowing, but knowing is not enough. It requires action, and it requires action on things that are going to fundamentally change human society. And you have a Congress right now, at least in the United States, that I don't believe is dealing with it, handling it appropriately. And so I hope that as y'all go back in your work, you will sketch out what it means for us in 10 years, in 20 years, to have the conversation about human rights and how we tackle that. I think that conversation will be much broader. Hopefully the technology and the tools will also be greater, but again, it's also the technology that challenges us as well. So, Godspeed on all of your work. Thank you so much for having me here.